She walked quietly into the Bullitt County courtroom, her face showing no emotion. It was as if there was no visible grief for the irreversible harm connected to the deaths of her 2 children. Her attorneys described her as a woman in a severe mental crisis, someone who had lost control.
Essentially, Tiffany's psychotic episode was brought on by opioid withdrawal. She abstained from use, and in trying to get clean, this was the side effect.
They argued that opioid withdrawal had triggered a state of psychosis. The defense claimed she was legally insane. A judge appeared to consider that argument, but then the prosecution presented the evidence.
Oh my God, he's I don't know, he's probably 6, there's blood all over the bed, a gun.
And everything changed. What you are about to see is the moment 32-year-old Tiffanie Lucas realized that her explanations could not stand against the truth. The moment she understood she would not be going home. Not that day, not ever again. Her young sons, 2 boys who love music, were gone. And the evidence of what truly happened on that November morning was captured through the fragmented words of their own mother. Footage from police body cameras, and surveillance video from a neighbor's camera. This is the deeply troubling case of a mother who opened fire on her 2 children. And every detail I am about to show you has been verified through court records, police body camera footage, 911 call recordings, and courtroom testimony. If you have never heard this story before, prepare yourself, because what happened in Shepherdsville, Kentucky on November 8, 2023 will challenge everything you thought you knew about maternal instinct, the insanity defense, and how a mother's own words can become the most damaging evidence against her. During Tiffany's questioning, investigators uncovered something extremely important to understanding what truly happened. She said destroyed any chance of claiming she did not know what she had done before the case brought national attention to Bullitt County. Tiffanie Lucas lived in Shepherdsville, Kentucky, a small city just south of Louisville. She was 32 years old on November 8, 2023, and she was the mother of 2 young boys, Jayden Howard and Maurice Baker Jr. The 3 lived in the Shepherdsville area, in the same home that would later become central to the court record. Jayden was 9 years old, Maurice was 6. They were half-brothers, sharing the same mother. And both were still at an age when daily life depended almost entirely on the adults around them. Their world was shaped by school routines, family schedules, and the ordinary rhythm of a small Kentucky community. Shepherdsville is the kind of place where neighborhoods can feel familiar, where people often recognize the homes, streets, and families around them. It sits near the larger Louisville metro area, but it still carries the quieter pace of a suburban county town. Mornings, they are usually defined by school buses, work commutes, coffee stops, and the steady movement of families beginning another day in that setting. Tiffanie Lucas was known first as a mother. Jayden and Maurice were not public figures. They were children growing up in a local community surrounded by relatives, neighbors, and the normal routines of childhood. To understand what later unfolded, it is important to begin here with the ordinary life that existed before any courtroom, headline, or criminal charge entered the story in Shepherdsville that November morning. Before November 8, 2023, relatives of Jayden Howard and Maurice Baker Jr. later told local reporters that they had worried about the boys' safety. According to those accounts, concerns involving Tiffanie Lucas had been raised with Child Protective Services. The state did not release specific records because child welfare files are confidential, and the matter was still active at the time. What remains clear from public reporting is that some family members believed the home environment had become unstable before the case reached court. That background does not explain every choice Lucas made. It does, however, place the morning of November 8 inside a broader pattern of concern. On cases involving a parent and young children, investigators often look beyond the final act. They examine the home, prior warnings, access to weapons, mental health concerns, and the dependency between the children and the adult responsible for them. That day began in Shepherdsville, Kentucky, inside the home where Lucas lived with her 2 sons. Jayden was 9, Maurice was 6. They were not strangers to the person later held responsible. They were her children, young enough to rely on adults for safety, care, and structure. At some point inside that home, both boys were harmed by gunfire. Later court proceedings would identify their mother as the person responsible. From a psychological perspective, that relationship is central. When a parent becomes the source of danger, the meaning of the act changes. It is not only a violent offense, it is a collapse of the most basic duty a parent has, to protect. In the language of criminal psychology, this kind of case falls within the broad category of filicide. The term describes a parent ending the life of a child. In this case, the dependency of the victims made the betrayal profound. About 4 minutes after the shots were heard, the emergency began to unfold outside the home on Bentwood Drive. A neighbor saw a woman collapsed in a front yard. She appeared shaken, short of breath, and disoriented. The woman was Tiffanie Lucas, according to accounts later described in court reporting. She was calling out that her children were dying. The neighbor, later identified as Sarah, recognized her from the street, though she did not know her well. She called 911 immediately. Within moments, Sarah's husband went toward the house to check on the children. He entered the home on Bentwood Drive and moved toward the bedroom. He found stopped him. 2 young boys were on the bed. Maurice Baker Jr. was 6 years old. Jayden Howard was 9. The man stayed on the line with dispatch and tried to describe what he was seeing as clearly as he could. His voice, according to reports, was shaken. But he continued giving information that would help first responders understand the urgency inside the home. The Bullitt County Sheriff's Department was dispatched to the Shepherdsville residence after the report of a shooting. When deputies arrived, entered the house and found the 2 boys with gunshot injuries. A neighbor was already in the bedroom, trying to help them. The boys were quickly taken from the home and transported to a hospital in Louisville. Despite the efforts to save them, both children later died. This stage of the case is important because it shows how quickly the incident became known to people outside the home. There was no long delay, no extended disappearance, and no attempt to hide what had happened over days or weeks. The first outside witnesses became involved almost immediately after the shots. Their actions helped turn a private household emergency into an active law enforcement response that same morning. From an investigative standpoint, the presence of neighbors mattered. Sarah's 911 call created the first official record of the emergency. Her husband. Entry into the home provided a near immediate account of the condition of the children and the location where they were found. When deputies arrived, they were not beginning with a vague missing persons report or a confusing timeline. They were responding to a specific address, a reported shooting, and 2 critically injured children inside a bedroom. For the broader narrative of the case, this moment marks the transition from family life to criminal investigation. It began with a neighbor seeing a distressed woman outside a home, quickly became a formal response involving dispatchers, deputies, emergency medical personnel, and later prosecutors. The discovery was immediate, the scene was contained, and the direction of the investigation began forming within minutes. On November 8, 2023, the focus of the investigation turned to Tiffanie Lucas almost immediately. Deputies with the Bullitt County Sheriff's Department arrived at the home in Shepherdsville after the shooting was reported. Inside, they found Jayden Howard and Maurice Baker Jr. critically injured. According to reporting from the Associated Press, a witness at the scene identified Lucas as the person who had fired the weapon, and a firearm was recovered in the same room where the children were found. That combination of facts gave investigators a clear starting point. Lucas was not an unknown person fleeing from a public scene. She was the boy's mother, she was connected to the home, and she was present in the immediate aftermath. The weapon was also recovered in the same space as the victims. For deputies, the early question was not simply who had been involved. The more complicated question became what Lucas understood, what she intended, and how her state of mind would fit into the criminal case that was beginning to form. Lucas was arrested that same day. She was later charged with 2 counts of murder and booked into the Bullitt County Detention Center at that stage. Was the defendant in a case that had moved quickly from emergency response to criminal prosecution. The legal process would take time, but the direction of the case had already changed. Investigators were no longer searching for a stranger. They were building a case around the person identified at the scene. Her early statements became an important part of that process. During the initial investigation, Lucas reportedly said the shooting was an accident. She also made statements suggesting she had been manipulated through Facebook or Wi-Fi. Those remarks later became significant because her defense team would explore a mental health argument before she eventually entered a guilty plea. From a psychological perspective, those statements are important, but they must be handled carefully. They do not allow anyone outside the court process to diagnose Lucas. What they show is that, in the aftermath of the shooting, she described the event in a way that shifted responsibility away from herself. Instead of presenting the act as a decision she made, she described it as something influenced by an outside force. In psychology, that kind of response can resemble externalization, a pattern in which a person places the cause of an action outside the self. That does not automatically mean a person is legally insane in an American courtroom. An insanity defense requires more than unusual statements or disturbing behavior. The question is whether the defendant, at the time of the offense, lacked the legal capacity to understand the nature or wrongfulness of the act. That standard is high. It usually requires expert testimony, mental health records, and a close review of the defendant's behavior before, during, and after the event. For investigators, Lucas S. statements created a second layer of inquiry. The physical evidence pointed toward who was responsible. The witness identification and the firearm helped establish the immediate facts. Her comments about an accident and outside manipulation raised questions about intent, awareness, and possible mental health concerns. Questions would later move from the interview room into the courtroom, where the defense and prosecution would have to decide how to frame the case. This stage marks a critical transition. The emergency at the home had ended. The children had been taken to the hospital. Lucas was in custody. From that point forward, the case became a legal examination of responsibility and intent. After Lucas was taken into custody, the investigation shifted back to the house on Bentwood Drive. Deputies and crime scene personnel treated the home as the central scene. Bedroom, where Jayden Howard and Maurice Baker Jr. had been found, became the focus of the physical examination. Investigators documented the room, position of the children, and the location of the firearm that had been recovered nearby. According to reporting from the Associated Press, a gun was found in the same room where the boys were located. That fact mattered immediately. It connected the emergency call, the witness account, and the physical scene into one direct line of evidence. Investigators were not working from an uncertain location or a delayed discovery. They had a specific room, a recovered weapon, and 2 young victims who had been found shortly after the shooting was reported. Officers also had the account of a witness at the scene who identified Tiffanie Lucas as the person responsible for firing the weapon. That statement gave investigators an early direction. In many criminal cases, police must spend days or weeks determining who had access, who had motive, or who may have been present in this case. The first phase moved faster because the home, the witness identification, and the recovered firearm all pointed toward the same person. The physical evidence did not answer every question. It helped establish what had happened inside the room, but it did not fully explain why it happened. That distinction became important as the case developed. The evidence could support the criminal charges, while Lucas' later statements raised questions about her state of mind. She reportedly said the shooting was an accident. She also described being influenced through Facebook, the internet, or Wi-Fi. Those remarks did not erase the physical evidence, but they shaped the legal questions that followed. From an investigative standpoint, the case had 2 layers. The first layer was factual and physical, where the boys were found, where the weapon was located, and what witnesses reported. The second layer involved intent, awareness, and mental state. The second layer would become relevant because the defense later explored a possible insanity argument before Lucas ultimately entered a guilty plea. The scene also showed why neighbors became important witnesses. A neighbor had called 911. Another had entered the home and remained close enough to describe the condition of the boys to dispatch. By the time deputies arrived, the emergency was already documented through the call, the witness response, and the first observations inside the house. As investigators collected evidence, the case moved from a household emergency into a formal murder investigation. The evidence gathered at the scene gave prosecutors a foundation for the charges. A witness identification gave them a direct account. Lucas' own early statements gave the defense material to examine together. All those pieces formed the core of the case that would later move into court as the legal process slowly continued. After Tiffanie Lucas was arrested, the case moved into Bullitt County escort system. In the first weeks after the shooting, she remained in custody at the Bullitt County Detention Center. Her bond was set at $2 million, a figure that reflected the seriousness of the charges and the risk the court believed was attached to the case. By December 2023, local reporting noted that the bond remained in place when Lucas appeared again before the court at that early stage. The courtroom was not yet hearing a full explanation of what had happened inside the home. The proceedings were more limited. The court was addressing custody status and the direction the criminal case would take. Still, the weight of the case was clear. 2 children were dead. Their mother was the defendant. Charges were 2 counts of murder. For the families of Jayden Howard and Maurice Baker Jr., every hearing became another step through a public process they had never asked to enter. High bonds signaled that this was not being treated as a routine domestic case. Prosecutors were handling a double homicide involving 2 young victims. The defendant was not a stranger to them. She was the person responsible for their care. That relationship made the case more difficult emotionally, and it also shaped the way the public understood the charges. As the case moved forward, Lucas's defense team began focusing on her mental state. In September 2024, people reported that her attorneys had filed notice of an insanity defense. The defense intended to introduce expert evidence related to a mental disease, mental defect, or another mental condition. That filing did not mean the court had accepted the argument. The defense was preparing to raise the question of whether Lucas's mental condition affected guilt or punishment. This strategy connected directly to Lucas' early statements. After the shooting, she had reportedly described the incident as an accident and said she had been manipulated through Facebook, the internet, or Wi-Fi. In a courtroom, those statements could not stand alone as a defense. They would need to be examined through legal standards, mental health records, expert testimony, and the facts surrounding the shooting. The defense position did not appear to dispute that the boys had been shot or that Lucas was the person accused. Instead, it pointed toward a different question: whether Lucas had the required level of criminal responsibility when the shooting occurred. In American criminal law, an insanity defense is difficult to prove. It is not enough for a defendant to behave strangely or make unusual statements. The legal issue is whether the defendant understood the nature of the act or understood that it was wrong. For prosecutors, the case was grounded in the physical evidence, witness identification, and the outcome of the shooting. A witness had identified Lucas as the person who fired the weapon. A firearm had been found in the room where the boys were located. The children later died from their injuries. Those facts gave the state a direct case, even as the defense explored questions about mental health. Before the case reached a December 2024 trial, Lucas changed course. On October 23, 2024, she appeared in Bullitt County Court and pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. Our reports described her as showing little visible emotion during the proceeding. By entering the plea, Lucas admitted legal responsibility for the deaths of Jayden and Maurice. Plea was significant because it was an open plea. That meant there was no fixed sentence already agreed upon between the prosecution and the defense. The judge would decide the punishment. Each murder count carried the possibility of a long prison term, including life for Lucas. This meant that pleading guilty did not guarantee leniency, avoided a full trial, but it left the final outcome in the hands of the court. For the families, the plea did not soften the impact of the case. Relatives of the boys had waited nearly a year for accountability. Public reporting described strong reactions from family members, including calls for the harshest punishment available. Bobby Baker, Maurice's aunt, said the boys deserved justice and that Lucas belonged in prison. Their grief was not only about the deaths themselves, it was about the person responsible. In their eyes, the crime represented a complete violation of the role a mother is supposed to hold. During sentencing, family members were given space to express the damage left behind. These moments are often among the most difficult parts of an American criminal proceeding. Victim impact statements allow relatives to speak not only about the crime, but about who the victims were and what was taken from the family. In this case, The statements centered on two children whose lives ended before they had the chance to grow up. The courtroom response showed how deeply the case had affected the community around the boys. Reports described an emotional hearing, with relatives demanding accountability, and the courtroom reacting strongly when the sentence was announced. The judge had to weigh the guilty plea to the facts of the case, the deaths of two children, and the responsibility Lucas had held as their mother. In the end, the court rejected any outcome that would allow a shorter sentence. The guilty plea ended the trial phase, but it did not reduce the seriousness of what the court had to address. By the time sentencing arrived, the central issue was what punishment could reflect the loss of Jayden Howard and Maurice Baker Jr. The answer would come in the form of 2 life sentences. On November 22, 2024, the case returned to Bullitt County, Kentucky, for sentencing. Tiffanie Lucas had already pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder, one for the death of Jayden Howard and one for the death of Maurice Baker Jr. The question before the court was no longer whether she would be convicted. It was what punishment could reflect the loss of 2 children and the responsibility she had held as their mother. Judge Rodney Burris imposed 2 life sentences. Local reporting from WAVE stated that Lucas would not be eligible for parole. Welke also reported that the judge chose the maximum sentence, giving 1 life sentence for each child. The decision made clear that the court was not treating the deaths as a single event with a single consequence. Each boy was recognized as a separate victim, with a separate life, a separate family bond, and a separate place in the community. Inside the courtroom, the sentencing carried a weight that went beyond legal language. Family members had waited more than a year for the case to reach this point. They had listened to the plea, followed the hearings, and carried the public burden of a private loss. Court TV reported that the judge spoke about the fear the children must have experienced when they saw their mother with the weapon. After the sentence was announced, people in the courtroom applauded quietly. The 2 life sentences became the final legal answer to the case. They did not restore Jayden and Maurice to their relatives. They did not resolve every question the family had raised about warning signs or child welfare concerns, but they did establish accountability. In the eyes of the court, the punishment had to reflect 2 lives lost, not one general tragedy alone. Tiffanie Lucas is serving her sentence in the Kentucky State Prison System after pleading guilty to 2 counts of murder in the deaths of her sons, Jayden Howard and Maurice. Baker Jr. public reports confirmed that she received 2 life sentences, and WAVE reported that she will not be eligible for parole. Her case is no longer centered on whether she will return to court for trial. That question ended for the boys' families. The case did not end with the sentencing hearing. They still carry the long-term impact of losing Jayden and Maurice, along with the questions they had raised before the shooting. Relatives had spoken publicly about concerns involving Child Protective Services, and about the painful handling of the boys' remains before the funeral. For them, the sentence brought accountability, not restoration. The Tiffanie Lucas case stands as one of the most painful kinds of family tragedies, because it involved a mother and the 2 young children who depended on her for safety. In cases where a parent harms a child, the act rarely appears from nowhere. It may sit inside a longer pattern of stress, isolation, declining caregiving, mental health concerns, or a household that others later describe as unstable. In this case, relatives had spoken publicly about concerns before the shooting, but the court did not identify one simple motive such as money, revenge, or a custody dispute. What made this case especially difficult was the reversal of the Mother S role. Jayden Howard and Maurice Baker Jr. were not strangers to Tiffanie Lucas. They were her sons. The home in Shepherdsville should have been a protected space for them. Instead, it became the place where the case began. Legally, the case moved through several important stages. Lucas was charged with 2 counts of murder. Her defense team later explored a mental health argument connected to her reported statements about being influenced through Facebook, the internet, or Wi-Fi. But the case did not end with a trial over that defense. Lucas entered a guilty plea, and the judge imposed 2 life sentences. That outcome shows that the court ultimately treated her as legally responsible for the deaths of both children. The sentence also recognized Jayden and Maurice separately, rather than folding their lives into one general tragedy. For the public, the case remains a reminder that family violence can be hidden behind ordinary doors, and that the most devastating danger can sometimes come from the person a child is taught to trust first. It is a case defined not by spectacle, but by responsibility, warning signs, and irreversible loss. The largest message from this case is that warning signs inside a family, especially when children are involved, should never be treated as minor concerns. Children depend on adults for safety, food, shelter, medical care, and emotional stability when relatives, neighbors, teachers, or other people close to a child begin to notice fear, neglect, instability, or unusual behavior from a caregiver. Those concerns deserve a serious response. The case also shows the limits of looking for one simple explanation. Mental health may be relevant in a criminal case, and it may help explain parts of a defendant's behavior, but it does not automatically remove responsibility, especially when two children lost their lives. Courts require evidence, expert review, and a strict legal standard before mental illness changes criminal responsibility. For viewers, the message is not to reduce the case to one label. It is about recognizing risk earlier. It is about listening when families say something is wrong. And it is about understanding that child safety depends not only on one household, on every person and system close enough to notice when that household begins to fail, long before harm becomes truly permanent. The first lesson is to take concerns about child safety seriously, even when the signs seem unclear at first. In many family cases, the people closest to a child may notice changes before anyone else does. A relative may see fear. A neighbor may hear conflict. A teacher may observe exhaustion, withdrawal, or a sudden shift in behavior. None of those details proves a crime is coming, but each one can be part of a larger picture. When children are too young to protect themselves, adults have to pay attention for them. The second lesson is that crisis inside a home should not be dismissed as private family trouble. Stress, mental health concerns, unstable housing, isolation, substance use, or declining caregiving can become dangerous when no one intervenes. Not every struggling parent will become violent, and not every troubled household will end in tragedy. But when children are involved, the standard for concern should be higher, not lower. The third lesson is about accountability after the fact. The justice system can assign responsibility. It can impose a sentence. It can create a public record of what happened, but it cannot restore the lives that were lost. In this case, 2 life sentences answered the legal question, but they did not undo the absence left in the families of Jayden Howard and Maurice Baker Jr. That is why. The value of telling this case is not to dwell on pain. It is to understand how quickly a family crisis can become irreversible, and why early action matters. The most important response to a case like this is not only punishment after harm has occurred, it is prevention, attention, and the willingness to act when a child may be in danger long before it is too late.